In the narrow streets of Budapest's Jewish quarter, where the scent of fresh bread from kosher bakeries mingled with the acrid smoke of coal fires, a seamstress named Rachel Saros would become the center of one of medicine's most terrifying mysteries. On a cold January night in 1904, Rachel closed her eyes for what she believed would be a normal night's sleep. But when dawn broke over the Danube, she was still awake, not drowsy, not restless, but fully, impossibly conscious. What began as a single sleepless night would stretch into 11 years of documented, medically supervised wakefulness that would challenge everything physicians understood about human consciousness, the necessity of sleep, and the limits of human endurance. Rachel's case would attract neurologists from across Europe, who watched in fascination and horror as her mind and body slowly disintegrated under the relentless burden of perpetual awareness, until death finally granted her the rest that medicine could not provide. The Budapest of 1904 was a city in the midst of its golden age, the jewel of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and one of Europe's most vibrant cultural centers. The recent unification of Buda, Pest, and Obuda had created a metropolis that rivaled Vienna and Paris in its architectural grandeur and intellectual sophistication. The city's broad boulevards, lined with elegant apartment buildings and punctuated by magnificent public buildings, reflected the confidence of a society that believed itself to be at the forefront of human progress. The Pest side of the city, where Rachel lived with her husband Istvan, was a bustling commercial district where Jewish immigrants from across the empire had established thriving businesses and cultural institutions. The great synagogue on Dohany Street, the largest in Europe, served as the spiritual center for a community that had found prosperity and relative acceptance in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of fin de siècle Budapest. The Jewish quarter itself was a maze of narrow streets and courtyards where traditional Orthodox families lived, alongside more secular Jews who had embraced the opportunities offered by Hungarian society. The area was filled with small workshops where skilled craftsmen produced goods for the growing middle class, while kosher restaurants and coffee houses provided gathering places where politics, literature, and business were discussed with equal passion. Rachel and Istvan Saros lived in a modest two-room apartment on the third floor of a building that housed several families of similar circumstances. Istvan worked as a bookkeeper for a textile merchant, while Rachel earned additional income as a seamstress, creating and mending clothes for the wives and daughters of Budapest's growing bourgeoisie. Their life was comfortable by the standards of their community, though they dreamed of eventually saving enough money to open their own shop. The couple had been married for 6 years and had been trying unsuccessfully to have children, a source of quiet sadness that they rarely discussed, but that weighed heavily on their relationship. Rachel, in particular, had begun to blame herself for their childlessness, wondering if some failing on her part was preventing them from achieving the family they both desired. Rachel Saros was known in her neighborhood as a woman of exceptional energy and dedication, often working late into the night by lamplight to complete the intricate embroidery and delicate alterations that were her specialty. Her customers praised her attention to detail and her ability to transform even the most challenging fabrics into beautiful garments. She was also known for her kindness, often taking in sewing work from poorer families at reduced rates and teaching young girls the skills they would need to support themselves. At 28, Rachel was considered to be in the prime of her life, with the dark hair and expressive eyes that were characteristic of her Sephardic heritage. She had immigrated to Budapest from Sarajevo as a child with her parents, who had sought better opportunities in the more liberal atmosphere of the Hungarian capital. Her family had prospered modestly, and Rachel had received an education that was unusual for women of her background, including basic literacy in Hungarian, German, and Hebrew. The first signs that something was amiss in Rachel's life appeared in late 1903, when she began to experience what she described as restless nights, during which sleep seemed to elude her despite her exhaustion from long days of work. Initially, both Rachel and Istvan attributed these episodes to stress and overwork, assuming that they would resolve themselves once she reduced her workload and got more rest. However, as the weeks passed, Rachel's sleep difficulties became more pronounced and more disturbing. She would lie in bed for hours, her body motionless, but her mind racing with thoughts and anxieties that seemed to multiply in the darkness. When she did manage to doze, she would awaken after only a few minutes, feeling as if she had never truly lost consciousness at all. The transformation from occasional sleeplessness to complete insomnia occurred with shocking suddenness on the night of January 15th, 1904. Rachel had gone to bed at her usual time, around 10 o'clock, after completing a particularly challenging piece of embroidery for one of her wealthier clients. She kissed Istvan goodnight and settled into their bed, expecting to fall asleep despite the mild restlessness she had been experiencing. But sleep never came. Rachel lay in the darkness, listening to her husband's steady breathing and the sounds of the city settling into night. The clip-clop of late carriages on cobblestones, the distant whistle of trains crossing the Danube bridges, the occasional call of night watchmen making their rounds. As the hours passed, she became increasingly aware that something fundamental had changed in her relationship with consciousness and rest. When dawn broke over Budapest and Istvan awakened to find his wife still lying with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling, he initially assumed she had simply had a particularly bad night. Rachel herself expected that the following evening would bring the sleep that had eluded her, and she went about her daily routine with the confidence that her body would eventually demand the rest it needed. But the second night passed exactly like the first, with Rachel lying motionless in bed while her mind remained fully alert and active. The third night brought the same result, and by the fourth day, both Rachel and Istvan began to realize that they were dealing with something far more serious than ordinary insomnia. Istvan insisted that Rachel see a physician, and they arranged a consultation with Dr. Bela Koranyi, a well-respected general practitioner who served many families in their neighborhood. Dr. Koranyi was a graduate of the University of Budapest's medical school and had built a reputation for his careful diagnostic skills and his compassionate treatment of patients from all social backgrounds. Dr. Koranyi's initial examination of Rachel revealed a woman who appeared to be in good physical health despite her obvious exhaustion. Her pulse was slightly elevated, her blood pressure was normal, and she showed no signs of fever or other obvious illness. However, the physician was struck by the intensity of her gaze and the slight tremor in her hands that suggested her nervous system was under considerable strain. The doctor's first hypothesis was that Rachel was suffering from neurasthenia, a condition that was commonly diagnosed in the early 20th century to describe a variety of nervous disorders that seemed to affect educated, sensitive individuals who were overwhelmed by the stresses of modern life. The treatment for neurasthenia typically involved rest, sedatives, and removal from stressful situations, a prescription that seemed perfectly suited to Rachel's apparent condition. Dr. Koranyi prescribed laudanum, a tincture of opium that was commonly used as a sedative and pain reliever, instructing Rachel to take a small dose each evening before bed. He assured both Rachel and Istvan that the medication would help her nervous system relax and allow her to return to normal sleep patterns within a few days. However, the laudanum had no effect whatsoever on Rachel's wakefulness. She took the prescribed dose and lay in bed with her eyes closed, but her mind remained fully alert throughout the night. Dr. Koranyi increased the dosage, then switched to morphine, then to chloral hydrate, each medication administered in doses that should have rendered any normal person unconscious, but none had any impact on Rachel's relentless wakefulness. As word of Rachel's condition spread through Budapest's medical community, other physicians became interested in her case. Dr. Erno Jendrasik, a prominent neurologist at the University of Budapest, examined Rachel and was astounded to find a patient who remained fully conscious despite having taken enough sedatives to kill a horse. He arranged for Rachel to be admitted to the university hospital for more intensive study and observation. The hospital admission marked the beginning of what would become an 11-year medical odyssey that would transform Rachel from a private individual into a scientific specimen studied by some of Europe's most distinguished physicians. The university hospital was a modern facility that prided itself on being at the forefront of medical research, and Rachel's case represented exactly the kind of unusual phenomenon that could advance scientific understanding of human physiology. Dr. Jendrasik's initial studies of Rachel involved continuous observation by medical students and nurses who documented her behavior around the clock. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Rachel never slept, not even for a few minutes. She would lie motionless with her eyes closed when requested to do so, but her breathing patterns, muscle tension, and responses to stimuli indicated that she remained fully conscious throughout these periods. The neurologist also conducted primitive tests of brain activity using galvanometers and other electrical instruments that were the predecessors of modern electroencephalography. These measurements consistently showed patterns of electrical activity that were associated with wakefulness rather than sleep, confirming that Rachel's brain was indeed functioning at full capacity 24 hours a day. As the weeks turned into months, Rachel's physical appearance began to change in ways that alarmed her physicians and horrified her family. Her skin took on a grayish pallor that made her look as if she was slowly dying from some internal poison. Dark circles appeared around her eyes, which seemed to sink deeper into their sockets with each passing day. Her hands developed a constant tremor that made it difficult for her to perform the delicate needlework that had been her livelihood. More disturbing still were the changes in Rachel's mental state. Her speech became increasingly disjointed and difficult to follow, as if her thoughts were racing too quickly for her to articulate them coherently. She would begin sentences and then trail off, seemingly distracted by internal experiences that she could not share with others. Her memory became unreliable, and she would sometimes forget conversations that had taken place just hours earlier. Dr. Jendrasik documented these changes meticulously, recognizing that he was witnessing something unprecedented in medical literature. No case of complete, sustained insomnia had ever been documented for such an extended period, and the progressive deterioration of Rachel's cognitive and physical functions provided unique insights into the role of sleep in human health and survival. The case attracted attention from neurologists across Europe, who traveled to Budapest to examine Rachel and propose their own theories about the cause of her condition. Dr. Auguste Forel from Switzerland suggested that Rachel might be suffering from damage to the brain structures that regulate sleep and wakefulness. Dr. Camillo Golgi from Italy proposed that her condition might be related to abnormalities in the nerve cells that control consciousness. Each visiting physician brought his own experimental treatments and theories, subjecting Rachel to a bewildering array of interventions that ranged from the scientifically plausible to the frankly bizarre. She was given ice baths and hot baths, subjected to electrical stimulation of various parts of her body, and treated with experimental drugs that had never been tested on humans. None of these interventions had any effect on her wakefulness, but they added to her suffering and further undermined her deteriorating health. Rachel herself became increasingly desperate as the months passed without any sign of improvement. She begged the physicians to find some way to let her sleep, describing the constant awareness as a form of torture that was slowly driving her insane. She spoke of feeling trapped inside her own consciousness, unable to escape into the oblivion that sleep would provide. The psychological impact of perpetual wakefulness was perhaps even more devastating than the physical effects. Rachel described experiencing a constant sense of unreality, as if she were living in a dream from which she could never awaken. Time seemed to lose its meaning when there was no cycle of sleep and waking to mark the passage of days, and she often became confused about whether events had happened recently or long ago. Istvan, meanwhile, was struggling to cope with watching his wife's gradual deterioration. He had taken leave from his job to care for Rachel, but there was little he could do beyond providing emotional support and ensuring that she took the medications prescribed by her physicians. The financial strain of Rachel's medical care and his lost income was enormous, but he refused to abandon his wife to the care of strangers. As Rachel's condition entered its second year, the medical establishment began to debate whether her case represented a genuine medical phenomenon or an elaborate form of hysteria or malingering. Some physicians argued that it was impossible for a human being to survive without sleep for such an extended period, and they suggested that Rachel must be sleeping without being aware of it, or that she was deliberately deceiving her observers. However, the continuous medical supervision and the objective measurements of her brain activity made such explanations increasingly implausible. Dr. Jendrasic and his colleagues were forced to conclude that they were indeed witnessing a genuine case of sustained wakefulness that challenged fundamental assumptions about human physiology. The third year of Rachel's insomnia brought new and more severe symptoms that suggested her body was beginning to break down under the strain of perpetual consciousness. She developed a persistent fever that fluctuated throughout the day, but never completely resolved. Her appetite disappeared almost entirely, and she began to lose weight at an alarming rate, despite the efforts of physicians to maintain her nutrition through forced feeding. More ominously, Rachel began to experience hallucinations and delusions that indicated her grip on reality was loosening. She would carry on conversations with people who were not present, respond to sounds that no one else could hear, and become agitated by threats that existed only in her increasingly disordered mind. The physicians treating her recognized these symptoms as signs of severe sleep deprivation psychosis, but they were powerless to address the underlying cause. Dr. Jendrasic's research into Rachel's case led him to focus on the hypothalamus, a small region of the brain that was known to be involved in regulating sleep and other basic biological functions. He theorized that Rachel might be suffering from damage to this area that was preventing her brain from initiating the sleep process, but the diagnostic tools available in 1907 were inadequate to test this hypothesis definitively. The neurologist also became interested in the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain that some researchers believed might be involved in sleep regulation. He arranged for Rachel to be treated with extracts from animal pineal glands, hoping that this might restore her ability to sleep. But these treatments proved as ineffective as all the others that had been attempted. As Rachel's condition entered its fourth and fifth years, she became a medical celebrity of sorts, with her case being discussed at medical conferences throughout Europe and written up in prestigious medical journals. However, this scientific attention did little to improve her quality of life or provide hope for recovery. If anything, the constant examinations and experimental treatments added to her suffering while providing no therapeutic benefit. The physicians treating Rachel were forced to confront the ethical implications of their continued study of her condition. While her case was providing valuable scientific insights into the nature of sleep and consciousness, it was also clear that their interventions were not helping her and might even be contributing to her deterioration. The question of whether to continue aggressive treatment or to focus on palliative care became a source of heated debate among her medical team. Rachel's family, meanwhile, was struggling with their own ethical dilemmas. Istvan had devoted 6 years of his life to caring for his wife, watching helplessly as she slowly wasted away before his eyes. He was torn between his love for Rachel and his recognition that her suffering seemed to be endless and pointless. The question of whether it would be more merciful to withdraw medical support and allow her to die naturally was one that haunted him, but that he could never bring himself to voice. The 6th and 7th years of Rachel's insomnia saw a gradual stabilization of her condition at a level of severe impairment that seemed to represent a new equilibrium between her body's attempts to survive and the devastating effects of sleep deprivation. She remained conscious but increasingly disconnected from reality, existing in a twilight state that was neither fully awake nor asleep. During this period, Rachel's case attracted the attention of Sigmund Freud, the Viennese neurologist who was developing his theories about the unconscious mind and the role of dreams in psychological health. Freud examined Rachel and proposed that her inability to sleep might be related to repressed psychological conflicts that were preventing her mind from accessing the unconscious states necessary for rest. However, Freud's psychoanalytic approach proved no more effective than the neurological interventions that had been attempted previously. Rachel's condition seemed to be beyond the reach of psychological interpretation or treatment, representing a purely biological dysfunction that could not be addressed through talking therapy or the exploration of unconscious conflicts. The 8th and 9th years brought a further decline in Rachel's condition, with the development of movement disorders that suggested her brain's motor control systems were beginning to fail. She developed a shuffling gait and difficulty with fine motor control that made it impossible for her to perform even simple tasks. Her speech became increasingly slurred and difficult to understand, though she remained able to communicate her continued suffering to those around her. Dr. Jendrasik's documentation of these changes provided valuable insights into the progressive effects of sleep deprivation on the human nervous system. His detailed case notes would later become a classic reference in the medical literature, though at the time they represented simply a chronicle of one woman's inexorable decline toward death. The 10th year of Rachel's insomnia was marked by the development of seizures that indicated her brain was becoming increasingly unstable under the strain of perpetual activity. These episodes were terrifying for both Rachel and her caregivers, as they represented a new level of neurological dysfunction that suggested her condition was entering its final phase. The seizures were treated with the anticonvulsant medications available at the time, but these provided only temporary relief and seemed to have little effect on the underlying progression of her condition. Rachel's physicians began to prepare Istvan for the possibility that his wife might not survive much longer, though they were careful not to make specific predictions about her remaining lifespan. As Rachel's condition entered its 11th year, it became clear that her body was finally succumbing to the effects of more than a decade without sleep. Her weight had dropped to less than 80 pounds. Her skin had taken on a waxy appearance that suggested organ failure, and her breathing had become labored and irregular. Most heartbreakingly, Rachel seemed to be aware of her approaching death and appeared to welcome it as a release from her years of suffering. She spoke frequently about her desire to finally rest and expressed gratitude to the physicians and family members who had cared for her throughout her ordeal. Rachel Saros died on March 3, 1915 at 2:17 a.m. after 4,015 consecutive days of documented wakefulness. Her final words, whispered to Istvan as he held her hand, were simply, "Finally." A single word that captured both her relief at the approaching end of her suffering and her gratitude for the rest that death would provide. The autopsy performed by Dr. Jendrasik revealed catastrophic damage to Rachel's hypothalamus and pineal gland, the brain structures that regulate sleep and circadian rhythms. The tissue in these areas was severely atrophied and showed signs of chronic inflammation that suggested a long-standing disease process. However, whether this damage was the cause of Rachel's insomnia or the result of 11 years without sleep remained unclear. The pathological findings also revealed damage to other parts of Rachel's brain, including areas involved in memory, emotion, and motor control. The widespread nature of this damage suggested that sleep deprivation had effects throughout the nervous system, not just in the specific regions responsible for sleep regulation. Dr. Jendrasik's final report on Rachel's case was published in the Journal of Neurology and became one of the most cited papers in the early literature on sleep disorders. His detailed documentation of her symptoms and their progression provided insights that would influence research into sleep and consciousness for decades to come. Modern medical science now recognizes Rachel's condition as likely representing a case of fatal familial insomnia, a rare genetic disorder that affects the brain's ability to regulate sleep and other autonomic functions. This condition, which was not identified until the 1980s, typically leads to death within a few years of onset, making Rachel's 11-year survival almost unprecedented. Contemporary sleep researchers studying Rachel's case have noted that her symptoms and progression were remarkably similar to those seen in patients with fatal familial insomnia, though the genetic testing that would be needed to confirm this diagnosis was not available in her era. Her case has become a landmark in the study of sleep disorders and has contributed to our understanding of the vital role that sleep plays in human health and survival. The ethical questions raised by Rachel's case continue to resonate in modern medicine, particularly regarding the treatment of patients with incurable conditions and the balance between research interests and patient welfare. Her story serves as a reminder of the importance of considering the human cost of medical research and the need to prioritize patient comfort and dignity, even when scientific curiosity might suggest otherwise. Istvan Saros never remarried after Rachel's death, spending the remaining years of his life as a quiet advocate for patients with rare medical conditions. He established a small fund to help families cope with the financial burden of caring for relatives with unusual illnesses, and he often spoke about the importance of treating such patients as human beings rather than medical curiosities. Rachel's case also had a lasting impact on the development of sleep medicine as a medical specialty. Her detailed medical records provided some of the earliest scientific documentation of the effects of severe sleep deprivation, and her story helped establish sleep as a vital biological function rather than simply a period of inactivity. The woman who couldn't sleep for 11 years teaches us that some aspects of human physiology are so fundamental that their absence is incompatible with life, and that the boundaries between consciousness and unconsciousness are more complex and fragile than we might imagine. Her story stands as a testament to human endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering, while also serving as a cautionary tale about the limits of medical intervention and the importance of compassionate care. In the archives of neurological medicine, Rachel's case remains a landmark study of sleep deprivation and its effects on the human brain and body. Her 11 years of documented wakefulness provide a unique window into the role of sleep in human health and survival, while her personal story reminds us that behind every medical mystery is a human being whose suffering deserves our compassion and respect. Next time, we'll explore a case that challenged Victorian understanding of human anatomy, a patient whose condition would force physicians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the limits of surgical intervention and the body's capacity for adaptation. If you found Rachel's story as compelling as I did, consider subscribing to witness more extraordinary cases from medicine's most mysterious chapters. Each week, we delve deeper into the archives where human endurance meets medical impossibility, where consciousness confronts its own limits, and where the past reveals the profound questions that continue to shape our understanding of life itself. Until then, remember that within each of us lies the potential for extraordinary endurance, sometimes beautiful, sometimes tragic, but always profoundly human in its complexity and mystery.